ever since I've known him, has been legendary. Partly in the sense that he has been talked about, but more in the sense that his crazed self-belief distorts reality. He forces you to hold him in the same awe in which he holds himself. No one else would breezily offer to give his own best man speech, but from no one else would the offer sound more reasonable. Chris's name first reached my ears at Ripon Grammar School when we were 12 or so, and in the same year but different forms. He was causing a stir at the Christian Club, of all places, singing his own songs and accompanying himself on the guitar. It's possible that he was, in those days, an innocent and pious child, a sort of Aled Jones with a Stratocaster. But it's also possible that he was contemplating a career as a charismatic cult leader and was testing the waters. A few years later, he had turned to movie making. I missed out on appearing in most of his films because he would pick on people in his own form. Chris would write, star, direct, and publicise. His friends would be given the job of making him look good. His enemies would be given the job of being beaten up in front of the camera and thrown in a lake. It says something for the charm of the man that they still turned up for filming. But it probably says more for Mrs. Snowden's cooking. I was dragged into Chris's orbit sometime in the 5th form, I think, when he found out I could play bass guitar. My first visit to Trinity Farm was to play in a nightclub scene he was filming. The story revolved around Chris playing enormously long guitar solos and acting smart at the expense of his willing dupes. I'd never been to a nightclub, and neither had Chris. But he had seen Purple Rain and realised that the only way in which it could be improved was if it starred him. I was impressed. And next year we decided to form a band. I liked music. I liked the early Beatles albums my parents had around the house, and I liked Iron Maiden. But I was beginning to notice that there weren't any girls in Iron Maiden, or at their concerts. I was ripe for a teenage musical epiphany, and Chris was happy to help out. He didn't like the Beatles, he worshipped them, and would spend hours in the school library adoring a Beatles encyclopedia as if it were the Lindisfarne Gospels. He taught me which Beatle was which, lent me the White Album, and blew my mind. I tried to draw the line at Prince, but girls liked Prince. And when a girl lent me Diamonds and Pearls, I gave up drawing the line and got funky. When you see my dancing this evening, that's Chris's fault. Our band played Chris's songs and cover versions of Guns N' Roses cover versions. A third of our songs were third hand, but Chris's guitar solos were all his own. Indeed, they were almost all of our albums. He paid David to make him a guitar like Prince's, and so it was, from a distance, and if you didn't plug it into an amplifier. Chris's dad got us a gig at Wetherby Prison, where our audience was polite. When we hauled our gear out of the hall, we found that the rest of the prisoners, the ones who hadn't been sedated for the afternoon, had covered our car with pot noodles. were living the rock and roll lifestyle. But it was time to break up the band. The drummer and I were going to university, while Chris heard the siren call of vivisection and went to work for Huntington Life Sciences to do unspeakable things to animals for a year. Despite the attractions of a life spent forcing dogs to smoke cigarettes, he entered the University of Lancaster to read history and to avoid going down south. During our visits to one another, I was able to compare our respective university experiences. Mine was chemistry with a dash of Brideshead Revisited, and Chris's was vodka with a dash of lime. My girlfriends were wholesome. His girlfriends were elegantly wasted. And Chris was just wasted. It looked like fun. During the vacations, he taught me how to drink, and we watched Beavis and Butthead till the early hours. Trinity Farm cemented its place in my heart. Part recording studio, part rural retreat. It's the sort of place that rock stars rent to record concept albums in. But Chris's parents were running the place, and not even the Beatles could have afforded them. Their hospitality was and is immense, and by getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, reminded us that other people were working, even if we were not. Back in Lancaster, Chris had his own band, Day Job, who sounded rather punk, but he was listening to Nick Drake and Syd Barrett, who didn't. He managed to reconcile these two sides of his musical personality by sending me compilation tapes. Chris's band hit the big time at King Tut's Wah Wah Hut in Glasgow, where Alan McGee had discovered Oasis a few years before. Alan McGee wasn't in the audience the night Day Job played, and Chris mostly avoided the fate that had befallen Noel Gallagher. Instead of becoming a washed-up, coke-addled millionaire, Chris became the director of a computer company in Lancaster. It was the Lancastrian .com boom, and it appeared to be some sort of scam, but it made him money, and before long he was a property tycoon as well. The company caught the notice of the government, and a Tory grandee came to visit the office. From the respectful way in which Chris spoke of this peer of the realm, I gathered something was afoot. Ever since I had known Chris, he'd been a class warrior, a working-class hero, in his own words. On our albums, he assigned my songs to the fictitious Old Boy Music record label. It was hard to see past his big head, but he might have had a chip on his shoulder. While I was cheering on the doomed Tories in the late 90s, Chris was joining the winning side and the Lancaster University Labour Club. Now he was palling around with cigar-smoking plutocrats, tearing up his Labour Party membership card and joining the still hopeless Conservatives. I asked myself what had happened. First, he had read the Alan Clark diaries and discovered that sophisticated Tories had equally sophisticated sex lives. Second, the government banned fox hunting, and Chris blew a fuse. The eloquent and endlessly entertaining rage, which has always poured out of Chris, and which had once been directed at his school teachers, now found a new focus. Chris had never been hunting, but it might have proved usefully annoying in a future life as a deranged country squire. Furthermore, hunt saboteurs were the same people who had tried to make him feel guilty about his after-hours experiments with the macaques at Huntington Life Sciences. Then the government banned smoking, and he went berserk. Because he wasn't just planning to smoke in a future life, he was smoking right now. He manned the barricades, and once he had recovered his breath, delivered a historical call to arms in his recently published book, which I urge you all to buy. As a one-man anti-smoking campaign, he has found a new calling, and we look forward to Chris becoming freshly enraged as future governments find more things to ban, and we watch him turn into a sort of healthcare Jeremy Clarkson. In recent years, Chris has been on several very long holidays, although like many others who go on long holidays, he prefers the word travelling. Sensibly, he has holidayed mostly in English-speaking parts of the world, keeping to a minimum that alienating sensation of being abroad. He has idled extensively in Australia, put his feet up in New Zealand, and vacationed in the US, where he visited me in Connecticut and drunkenly lost his bank card 3 days into a 3-month jaunt. He bravely holidayed on, writing a very funny blog for the local newspaper he was supposedly working for, who billed it as his trip of a lifetime. Trip of a summertime would have been more accurate, and he was soon off again, burning his bridges at the Northern Echo and taking a scarcely earned break in the Far East. Disoriented at finding himself outside the Anglosphere, he surrendered entirely to hedonism, picking up some French in Vietnam and picking up some more in Thailand. His life was turning into a Graham Greene novel. Somewhere in Indochina, I suppose, he hit bottom. Sitting at a filthy bar and catching sight of his unshaved face in a mirror, his thoughts turned to home and to those who loved him. Emma Chapman's face seemed to hover before him in a cloud of opium smoke. Suddenly, everything was clear. Shaking himself out of his trance, he paid his bill, bade farewell to the pretty dancer whose feet he saw now were bigger than his, and headed to the airport. The rest we know. Chris settled down, partially overcoming his hostility to the south of England for Emma's sake. Unable to resist a losing cause, he got a job at another local newspaper and embarked upon the statistical analysis of dozens of second-hand smoking studies. Now, when I visit, I'm woken at 5 o'clock in the morning, not by Chris's dad, but by the blasted Brighton seagulls. Chris may not be writing songs anymore, but he's still firmly on course to be famous, and has found a beautiful, clever, and astonishingly tolerant wife to be famous with. Will you please stand and raise your glasses to Chris and Emma?